You've heard about Roman glory, roads, aqueducts, and law. But what they don't tell you is what happened to the people Rome crushed to get there. They didn't just win wars, they erased the people they defeated. And the worst part? They called it peace. Entire civilizations wiped clean. Children stolen, temples burned, bodies nailed to crosses just to make a point. This wasn't conquest, it was psychological extermination. And once you see how Rome really built its empire, you'll never look at its history the same way again. What if your entire civilization was swallowed whole and then rewritten in Latin? That's what it meant to be conquered by Rome. They didn't just invade, they dismantled. First, your gods were mocked, your temples rededicated, your rituals outlawed. Then came your language, replaced with commands barked in Latin. Your scrolls were burned, your history overwritten. Your heroes became villains, your children taken, renamed, and raised to love the empire that destroyed their ancestors. And the most terrifying part, your people eventually forgot they were ever anything else. Rome called it Pax Romana, Roman peace. But peace was just the silence left after they shattered your identity. Emperors like Augustus and Hadrian believed true conquest wasn't won by swords, but by minds. They didn't just want your submission, they wanted your transformation. Entire cultures were reduced to ruins, not because they resisted, but because they remembered. And that memory had to be erased. The Gauls lost their druidic wisdom, the Carthaginians lost their gods, the Egyptians saw their ancient deities crushed beneath Roman statues. The Jews watched their temple burn while their sacred city was renamed and rebuilt to reflect Roman pride. This wasn't war, it was psychological annihilation dressed as civilization. A cold, calculated erasure where emperors didn't just want you defeated, they wanted you to worship them for doing it. Rome didn't just build roads and aqueducts. It built a machine that crushed difference, absorbed identities, and forced conquered peoples to thank them for the privilege of being devoured. This was the cost of falling to Rome. Not just slavery or tribute, but spiritual extinction. And as the ruins of those civilizations now gathered dust beneath Roman stone, the echoes of the erased still whisper, they didn't just kill us, they unmade us. To Rome, rebellion wasn't just crushed, it was crucified, and not in secret. It was displayed like theater. After the Spartacus revolt, over 6,000 of his captured followers were nailed to wooden crosses along the Appian Way, one every few dozen steps, stretching for over 120 miles. Their bodies twisted in agony, their screams silenced by blood loss and sunstroke. They weren't buried, they were left to rot. Flies fed on them, crows pecked at their eyes. Travelers passed the spectacle daily. That was the point. This wasn't execution, it was empire branding. Roman emperors like Crassus didn't just want rebels dead, they wanted them to serve as warnings carved into skin and bone. Crucifixion wasn't reserved for high crimes, it was used to terrorize the conquered into submission. Slaves, dissidents, prisoners of war. If you defied Rome, you didn't vanish quietly. You became a symbol of what happens when you forget your place. Sometimes, crucifixions were carried out in batches, dozens at a time, at the edge of cities or beside temples. Entire communities were forced to watch as fathers, sons, even young boys were hoisted up and pierced. No quick death, no honor, just hours or days of exposure, agony, and humiliation. Guards ensured no one intervened. Mercy was treason. For Romans, this was as much performance as punishment. The crowd didn't flinch. They cheered. Some brought food and watched like it was sport. The suffering of conquered peoples became public entertainment, ritualized into a grotesque display of imperial control. To die by Roman crucifixion wasn't just to lose your life, it was to lose your dignity, your body turned into a billboard of despair. And when the wind blew through the crosses lining the road, it wasn't just the trees that whispered, it was the dead, still screaming. Conquest was only the beginning. What followed was cultural execution. Roman emperors didn't just want territory. They wanted silence. Silence from your gods, your language, your stories. Once conquered, your identity became a threat, and threats had to vanish. Cities were renamed. Temples were rededicated. Statues of foreign gods were shattered, melted down, or replaced with Roman deities. The message was clear. Your past was irrelevant. Rome was your present and your only future. Local languages, once sung in prayer or carved in sacred scripts, were slowly strangled. Latin replaced them in law, in trade, in schools. Generations grew up unable to speak the tongue of their ancestors. A slow erasure, hidden beneath education and administration. It wasn't called destruction, it was called progress. Sacred festivals were outlawed or co-opted. Druids in Gaul were hunted into extinction, not because they wielded swords, but because they held on to ancient truths Rome couldn't control. Egyptian priests were silenced, their temples turned into monuments for emperors who had never set foot on the Nile. Gods that had been worshipped for millennia were recast in Roman likeness or forgotten entirely. Rome didn't burn every scroll or tear down every shrine. They didn't have to. They built new roads over old paths, new cities over sacred lands. They buried the old world beneath layers of marble and law. The past wasn't destroyed. It was overwritten. A new religion, a new ruler, a new name on your home, and no space to grieve what was lost. By the time a child was born under Roman rule, they no longer remembered what had been taken. That was the goal, not just to kill a culture, but to make its own descendants forget it ever existed. And Rome did it, over and over again, quietly, efficiently, permanently. Rome didn't just burn cities, it burned memory. When the legions arrived, scrolls burned alongside homes. Libraries, those fragile vaults of wisdom, were treated as threats, not treasures. In Alexandria, the greatest library in the ancient world vanished in waves of fire, war, and political convenience. Hundreds of thousands of texts, mathematics from India, astronomy from Babylon, medicine from Egypt, gone. Not lost. Erased. Roman emperors understood something chilling. Knowledge is dangerous when it doesn't serve the empire. After uprisings in Carthage and Dacia, intellectual centers were targeted. Temples that doubled as schools were torched. Historical records, written in the native tongue, were destroyed. Philosophy, law, folklore, anything that reminded a people of who they were before Rome, set ablaze. This wasn't collateral damage. It was strategy. Rome didn't want educated rebels. They wanted obedient provincials. If your ancestors wrote treatises, epics, or religious texts, they were useless unless they praised Caesar. So they burned. And when the smoke cleared, Rome filled the vacuum with its own version of history. Edited, curated, safe. The fire wasn't always literal. Sometimes it was policy. Texts were banned. Local historians were silenced. Indigenous teachers were replaced by Roman tutors. Libraries that once brimmed with centuries of thought were repurposed into forms of imperial propaganda. We don't know what was lost. That's the horror. Entire languages, sciences, cosmologies vanished without a trace. The empire called it civilization, but in truth it was cultural sterilization. Rome made sure its voice was the only one left echoing through time. And to do that, it lit the past on fire and stood watching while centuries of human thought curled into smoke. Not all conquests happen with swords. Some happen with silence and ash. Rome had a special punishment for the strongest of the conquered. Entertainment. If you were fierce in battle, fearless in defense of your homeland, you weren't honored. You were caged, stripped, chained, sold. And then you were thrown into a blood-soaked arena to die for applause. Gladiators were not celebrities. They were property, chosen from the most defiant warriors of defeated tribes, Thracians, Gauls, Nubians, Dacians. They were paraded like trophies before Roman crowds who cheered not for their skill, but for their suffering. The Colosseum wasn't a stadium, it was a slaughterhouse dressed in marble. These men were trained like beasts, starved, beaten, drilled. Their reward for surviving? A chance to fight wild animals, other slaves, or sometimes dozens at once, with weapons that were often dull, brittle, or intentionally broken. The outcome wasn't victory. It was spectacle. The more brutal the death, the louder the cheers. Some gladiators survived. Rarely. And even then they weren't free. A lucky few might earn a wooden sword in their release. Most died within their first year. The empire didn't care. There were always more to take their place. More sons of crushed nations, more warriors torn from the ashes of rebellion. Rome turned human agony into a public ritual. Senators watched from private boxes. Children clapped as limbs were severed. Blood watered the sand daily. And the strongest men from once proud peoples died not as heroes, but as warnings, broken beneath the boots of empire, discarded after serving their final purpose. Glory in Rome wasn't about honor. It was about humiliation. And the gladiator's roar, once defiant, was drowned out by the laughter of those who made sport of his pain. Rome didn't just conquer bodies, it colonized minds, and the youngest were always the easiest to mold. Elite children from conquered tribes weren't slaughtered like rebels. They were taken, removed from their families, stripped of their names, their languages, their gods, and reshaped into Romans. It wasn't mercy, it was strategy. These boys, often the sons of chieftains and local rulers, were sent to live in Roman households or military academies. There, they were taught to worship the empire that destroyed their homes. Latin replaced their native tongue. Roman law replaced tribal honor, and Caesar replaced their fathers. They were fed Roman ideals, dressed in Roman garb, taught Roman history, rewritten, of course, to make their own ancestors seem savage and backward. The message was subtle, but relentless. Rome had saved them. Everything else was shame. And once fully Romanized, these children were sent back, not as enemies, but as governors, priests, military officers, tools of imperial control wearing the mask of native leadership. To their broken communities, they were familiar faces delivering Roman orders. To the empire, they were assets, proof that even loyalty could be engineered. This wasn't just indoctrination, it was identity theft. Generations grew up with divided souls, torn between the memory of their blood and the pride of their empire. Rome had turned them into bridges of betrayal, walking proof that resistance was not only futile, but unnatural. And so, a new kind of conquest emerged, not through war, but through education, not with chains, but with books. The mind became the battlefield, and Rome won by stealing the future before it could ever remember the past. In Rome, faith was tolerated, until it wasn't. Religion, to the emperors, wasn't sacred. It was political, a tool, a threat, or both. If your gods bowed to Jupiter, fine. If they resisted, they were erased. Rome's tolerance ended the moment your belief challenged imperial control. The Druids of Gaul weren't targeted for swords, they were hunted for sermons. Their sacred groves were burned, their rituals banned, their priests executed. Why? Because they held the power to unite tribes, and Rome couldn't afford belief systems that inspired loyalty beyond the empire. Religion had to serve Caesar, or be crushed. In Judea, Roman governors desecrated holy sites and mocked sacred laws. Pagan statues were erected in Jewish temples. Sabbath observance was punished. When protest followed, Rome responded with siege towers and slaughter. It wasn't just about land. It was about obedience, and spiritual independence was treason. Emperors like Nero and Domitian used religion as scapegoat and spectacle. Christians were fed to lions, set on fire, crucified, not for their crimes, but for their refusal to worship Roman gods or Caesar himself. Martyrdom became a form of defiance, and Rome responded with theatrical brutality. But when convenient, Rome co-opted what it couldn't destroy. Local deities were absorbed into the Roman pantheon. Sacred days were renamed and rebranded. Paganism became imperial propaganda, and the gods were drafted into service. Unity wasn't achieved through belief. It was forged through fear and assimilation. Faith under Rome became a weapon, not one of salvation, but submission. If your god didn't kneel, you bled, and if you prayed too loudly, Rome made sure no one heard your final words. In the end, worship wasn't free. It was taxed, monitored, and held hostage by the empire that demanded to be its own god. Rome didn't always need fire to destroy a people. Sometimes they just closed the gates and waited. Siege was a slow death, and Rome perfected it. Carthage, Jerusalem, Numantia. Cities that dared to resist were turned into prisons of hunger and rot. Water lines were cut, farmlands torched, supplies blocked. Starvation wasn't a side effect. It was the plan. In Carthage, after years of bloody conflict, Rome made its final move. They surrounded the city, starved it into madness, then stormed in and slaughtered what remained. Survivors were enslaved. Homes were razed. Salt was plowed into the soil so nothing would grow again. It wasn't conquest, it was deletion. In Jerusalem, the siege was biblical in scale. Rome choked the holy city for months. Food vanished. Mothers boiled roots. Children begged in the streets. When the walls finally fell, the temple, the beating heart of Jewish faith, was torn down stone by stone. Fire consumed sacred scrolls. Tens of thousands were killed. The rest were scattered or enslaved. A nation shattered. And it wasn't just the big cities. In Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, anywhere resistance took root, Rome responded with siege and starvation. Villages were cut off, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. Those who surrendered were enslaved. Those who didn't, starved in silence. Siege warfare was genocide in slow motion. No honor, no mercy, just walls, waiting, and the slow withering of life behind them. Rome didn't just want land. They wanted memory erased. A salted field, a burning temple, a people so broken they'd never rise again. When Rome laid siege, it didn't end with surrender. It ended with extinction, and the message was always the same. Resist, and your city becomes a tomb. Your name, a footnote. Your god, dust. Rome didn't just take territory, it took bodies. Women from conquered lands were captured, chained, and redistributed like livestock. Spoils of war turned into tools of empire. Sexual slavery wasn't a side effect. It was policy, a reward for soldiers, a punishment for the defeated, a system designed to erase bloodlines and rewrite identities. One womb at a time. Captured women were marched through streets in chains, then sold in markets beside cattle and grain. Some were sent to Roman households as concubines or domestic slaves. Others were forced into military brothels. Their names were stripped, their languages silenced. Their children, fathered by Roman men, were born into a world where their mother's culture didn't exist. This was Rome's silent weapon, biological conquest. Where swords failed, pregnancy succeeded. Entire tribes were absorbed not by treaties, but by childbirth. The empire expanded not only through borders, but blood. And the offspring? Raised Roman, taught Latin, given Roman names. Their maternal heritage erased by law, by practice, by force. There were no inheritance rights for these women, no family protection, no consent. Just bodies used to further the empire's reach. Over time, distinct ethnic identities, Celtic, Illyrian, Iberian, began to blur and vanish, not through open genocide, but through calculated dilution. Rome turned women into battlegrounds, conquest engraved into flesh and passed on through generations. It wasn't just slavery. It was slow annihilation by bloodline. By mixing, dominating, and overwriting, Rome ensured the people they conquered became Roman in name, but rootless in origin. And centuries later, in the DNA of millions, traces remain, not as heritage, but as evidence. Rome didn't just conquer lands. It bred out the memory of those it defeated and called it civilization. They called it Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But peace, in Rome's world, meant silence. The silence of razed cities, of dead languages, of gods without temples. It wasn't harmony. It was domination, purchased with blood, enforced through terror, and remembered only by the ruins left behind. Behind every marble arch stood a village that no longer existed. Behind every Roman road, 1,000 bodies buried beneath it. The glory of the empire, its columns, its forums, its law, was fertilized with bones, and the cost of that beauty was the erasure of entire civilizations. Rome didn't bring peace. It brought submission. Peace was a tombstone over what used to be Gaul, Carthage, Judea, Dacia, Britannia. Cultures were not integrated. They were overwritten, and those who didn't conform were silenced, publicly, permanently. They built statues to victory, but never to the conquered. The voices of those crushed under Roman boots never made it into history, because Rome made sure they wouldn't. Scrolls were burned, names forgotten, the memory of resistance replaced with triumphal parades and patriotic lies. Even the term barbarian was propaganda. Rome's way of erasing the dignity of those who dared to exist outside its grasp. Pax Romana was a mask. Underneath was fear, exploitation, and loss. An empire so skilled at destruction, it convinced the world to admire what was built atop the ashes. But the ruins don't lie. They tell a different story. Not of peace, but of power. Not of unity, but of erasure. Rome may have fallen, but the silence it left behind still echoes. Because the greatest crime of the empire wasn't what it conquered, but what it made the world forget. Peace didn't build Rome, bones did, and the empire wore them like a crown.